Hello and welcome to this little teaching video. I'm excited to do this, but also very nervous, so we'll see how this goes. But we're going to just dig right in here. The topic I chose to talk about was the church and Christ's bride, and this is found in Colossians 1. I know we talked about this in class, and then over the last few months, I know I heard a sermon that gave me some inspiration for this, and so it's been a topic that I've been interested to work on, and I'm excited to get into this. The church, Christ's bride. As we look at the church at Broad today, we see both good and bad. At times, it can be discouraging, and at times, we stand in awe as we see God work. As we talk about Christ's bride for just several minutes, we want to focus on what hinders the church from growth and what aids the church in growth. And one of my sources had an introduction talking about the chapter in Colossians that I just wanted to read here. This is from the website called Crossway, What Does It Mean That Christ is the Firstborn of All Creation? This is by Alistair Wilson. And in the paragraph that is called Confession and Worship of the Church, it says, "This passage is often described as a hymn because it appears to reflect the confession and worship of the church, and because it clearly has been crafted with some care. Some commentators have argued that while all of these observations are true, we should be careful not to rush too quickly to use the term hymn. To use this term, they argue, seems to imply a work of poetry intended to be sung, and it is not at all clear that such is the nature of this passage. Peo argues, however, that the term hymn is appropriate if understood in its literary context. Many scholars have also claimed that this text is tradition. By this, they mean that Paul has adopted material already in circulation and incorporated it into his letter. Once again, we should be cautious about this view. The supposed prior history of this text is entirely conjectural, regardless of any possible history of the text or certain parts of it. We can say that it is now fully integrated into its context and so expresses just what Paul intended to say. Whether others had a hand in shaping the passage at an earlier stage is irrelevant. It is Paul's thought now, and all that we know of the richness of Paul's theological thought leads us to conclude that he is entirely capable of producing such a glorious passage of praise." This was just interesting to me because this passage, especially where it talks about the church, is very beautiful, and it talks about all that God created and that he's over all. And that's God's desire for the church, is that he's over all and that it's a beautiful picture of what he's designed and created. And so this was just really interesting to me. Next, we're going to read the passage in which we're going to focus on today. That is Colossians 1:15-20. "Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in him should all fullness dwell, and having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him to reconcile all things unto himself. By him, I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven." And I think this is really interesting how this starts out with talking about who God is and who he is to us. It talks about him being the invisible God, the firstborn. By him all things were created that are in heaven, earth, visible, invisible. It just goes into detail about what God created. And then it explains that he is the head of the church and the head of the body, and that this is his place. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that God is the creator and he is over all as we look into this. First, we want to look at the purpose of why this letter was written, because it shows us the heart of Paul and of Christ. In the book, A Popular Survey of the New Testament by Norman Geisler, we see several purposes behind writing Colossians. Number 1, Paul desired to show the Colossians their completeness in Christ. Number 2, he wanted to lead believers into spiritual maturity. Number 3, his design was to counter Gnostic-like, legalistic, mystical heresy in the church. And number 4, he wanted to teach about our new life in Christ. Number 5, he wanted to inform them about his state of affairs. Finally, what we want to get from this book is the theme, and that is completion in Christ, which that correlates with the first point. Paul desired to show the Colossians their completeness in Christ. And that is completion in Christ. As we read over these different purposes and even the theme, something that stands out to me is completeness in Christ. This is what Christ desires to be through us and the church. He is all and makes everything complete. He is the head. An important aspect of this passage is recognizing that Jesus is the head and he's the head of the body, the church. In Craig Keener's commentary, Bible background, it says, head could mean authority, most respected, or honored. God was sometimes called the beginning. In Jewish tradition, it was a natural term for the one from whom all things began. God is the head of the church, but not just the church. He is over all, and like verse 17 says, by him all things consist. Too many times we forget our place under God. We forget he is over not just the church, but over us as well. We start to take things into our own hands, especially when things come up with decision making and those in leadership. We all have different opinions and ideas, and oftentimes the flesh gets involved when we are not fully sold out to God. Not just one person in ourselves, but as a church. Things will flow and we will make godly, unselfish decisions together. God has a perfect and beautiful plan for his church, and we've seen this lived out. We don't always see this. A lot of times we see churches that are separating and, splitting and breaking up, and they're just making decisions and their flesh is coming through, and you see that Christ is not over this and through this, and that's something sad to me. Another point I wanted to throw in here was that I think when we have God in the right place in our hearts, when he is first and when we love him most of all, then we will love men right. And I think that's just a really important aspect of the church at large. The church, even if it's our own church, not just necessarily the church abroad, but even our own personal churches, I think that we need to have our relationship right with God in order to function right as a church. God has a beautiful design, and it's really sad to see the testimony, the bad example that a lot of Christians are leaving behind. But I think it's possible through his grace and through his strength to live a life that is a good testimony and that is showing forth Christ's love and unselfishness and making decisions for the better of the church and for each other. So that's all I had. We will close there.